Hello, I'm Cynthia McCallister. This video is entitled Concepts for a New Foundation for Schooling. In the last lecture, we explored some of the reasons why schooling needs to be restructured from an historical standpoint. There are also reasons that justify change from a scientific standpoint. These reasons will be the focus of this lecture. The learning cultures approach is based on a few key insights from the fields of science and philosophy. The aim of this lecture is to expose you to these key insights so that you'll have a more solid grounding in the reasons why learning cultures environments are structured the way they are. As you learned in the previous lecture, formal education developed as a way to systematically transmit knowledge from one generation to the next. Invariably, in any kind of social practice, dynamics of power and authority play out. Formal education is an arena in which the politics of power play out in every society. The educational theorist and activist Paulo Freire wrote extensively on these power dynamics. He described education as a banking approach. This banking metaphor views teachers and other school authorities as depositing knowledge into the minds of students, and views students as passive receptacles of the content of deposits. Because of the domination-submission dynamic inherent in the process, Freire explains that education has often been an instrument of oppression through time. This banking model views learners as passive, ignorant, and subjects to be controlled. Freire proposed the development of critical consciousness in the oppressed through a dialogic education, the aim of which would be to liberate the individual through instruments of cooperation, organization, unity, and cultural synthesis. Since the publication of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed in 1970, the cognitive revolution introduced new ways to investigate human cognition and consciousness. As you will learn in this course, now working with definitions and conceptual tools of self-determination, self-theories of intelligence, intentionality, will, consciousness, and co-consciousness, we can more strategically understand and operationalize liberating educational practices. To liberate students so that they are both capable of and inclined to think for themselves is a central aim of learning cultures. Prior to the last half century, it was mostly assumed that literacy, the ability to read and write in functional ways, was built on how well the person built up the subskills or isolated cognitive processes used in reading and writing. But the thinking about what literacy is and how it develops has evolved significantly over the last several decades. Scholars of literacy now understand that it's more like a social condition than an accumulation of purely cognitive skills. That's to say that literacy is really a new form of conscious awareness that's an outcome of our experiences as a participant in social situations where texts are used and produced. Through participation, background abilities or skills are developed and stored as memories to be retrieved and used again. This view contrasts the more prevailing view that reading and writing competencies are the result of direct instruction of discrete skills. Of course, literate persons possess background abilities and skills that allow successful participation in literacy situations, but these are acquired through social participation. The condition of literacy is better viewed as a state of conscious awareness about how written language works, which can only be achieved through interaction with others that allow the learner to gain new perspectives about how symbols are used in conventional ways to represent thought and language. The learning cultures model is based on the belief that literacy is a social condition, a heightened or altered sense of awareness about something that is an outcome of social interaction in which texts are used. With this significant emphasis on social practices as the key to heightened awareness, making sure that students have sufficient opportunities to take part in social situations in which texts are used, and holding students accountable to using text in ways that support literacy awareness is the goal of instruction. This focus is a shift away from the direct instruction of isolated reading or writing skills, a method that has dominated reading instruction traditions for over 100 years. The next key insight has to do with learning. What do we mean when we say we're learning or that we have learned something? What is learning? Philosophers and scientists have grappled with this question for hundreds of years. Building on the work of these thinkers, neuroscientist Eric Kandel recently discovered that learning, in its most essential biological form, is the development of new physical structures. Neurons in the body literally grow new connections when something has been learned. These new connections are known as memory. Studies of learning have conclusively proven that certain forms of learning about people, places, and things, especially of the sort expected in the formal curriculum of school, depends on the development of a special type of memory. It's called explicit or declarative memory. This type of learning depends on the learner being consciously aware and selectively attending to the object of learning. A different kind of memory, implicit memory, develops without conscious awareness in response to external stimuli that's sufficiently strong to support new connections between neurons. So explicit or declarative memory only develops when the learner wills it to develop by devoting attention to the object of learning. Explicit memory is what the formal school curriculum depends upon for achievement to occur. Put another way, unless a learner is selectively attending to a certain thing, he or she will not develop a memory for that thing. The learning cultures model is organized to make students' selective attention be the first priority. Every activity is developed in ways that hold students responsible for attention and engagement. This is because a system that provides a more active role for students helps support deeper learning. If the person is not attending, no learning occurs. So even if a teacher delivers a bang-up lesson, not a trace of learning will be left behind in the mind of an inattentive student. In other words, you laboriously plan lessons full of explicit instruction and teach with all your heart, but if your students are not willfully attending to the things that you're teaching, they're not learning. The second key insight has to do with the nature of thinking and being. Until the last half-century, education practices have been governed by rational empirical theories and philosophies. Rationalism and empiricism are two different sides of what has been the coin of the realm in all of philosophy since antiquity. Rationalist theories emphasize what exists in the person a priori, or before the learning activity occurs. In other words, the person is equipped for learning through structures in the brain that already exist. Through the process of evolution and adaptation, it's reasoned, humans develop structures in the brain that are dedicated to specific kinds of learning and cognitive processing. The rationalist paradigm is based on the understanding that the human brain originates with specific structure called modules. These modules are evolutionary adaptations and hold genetically inherited capacities. All mental processes, from sense perceptions to the ability to mentally visualize situations or make logical causal inferences, are activities related to specific modules. Modules exist at birth. Through experience and support through the environment, they get developed. Though external stimuli are necessary for learning, the locus of the phenomenon of learning and development remain isolated within the individual. This is also called the Nativist Perspective, and it's a view based on the logic that thinking capacities are innate and developed through interaction in the world. But if the module isn't developed, so the reasoning goes, it withers on the vine, so to speak. For example, if the young child is not adequately supported by environmental stimuli so that the modules involved in language development are appropriately stimulated, language abilities don't develop. The brain, it was reasoned, is an organ structured by modules that are essentially programmed to function in certain ways. On the other side of the coin is the Empiricist Paradigm. This paradigm explains the brain and the mind as a blank slate. Do you recall Locke's tabula rasa? Empiricist theories emphasize how learning results from interactions within the environment. The learner begins as a blank slate and learns and develops as a result of external stimulation. While this view accepts that phenomena outside the person have a role in constituting what finally develops inside the person, scientific and theoretical empiricist viewpoints remain entirely concerned with cognition at the level of the individual and view learning as an autonomous individual process. Piaget was a proponent of this view. Rational empirical paradigms differ about whether learning is best explained by the cognitive machinery humans were born with, or whether external stimulus is responsible for building the machinery. Neither take into account the way in which the thinking person interacts within the social world and how these interactions play a part in learning and development. In other words, rational empirical paradigms accept that the machine and its mechanism of action are located within the head of the individual person. 5 decades of research now cast doubt on rational empirical descriptions of thinking and learning. A new paradigm is now emerging to explain human thinking as a distinctively social endeavor. Socio-cultural theories reject the idea that the machine of cognition exists exclusively inside the person, an assumption of rational empirical methods. Instead, it's understood that the locus of thinking, learning, and consciousness exists outside the individual. The machine is somewhere between the individual and the environment and his or her relationship to the environment. In cooperative unison reading, a practice you'll learn about in a subsequent lecture, we tell students to breach or stop the group when they're reading if they have a question or something to say. So breach. If you are like most people, this idea that the thoughts we think are not located inside our heads, but out in space somewhere, is at first mind-blowing. You might even be skeptical. Be curious instead. Have you heard the phrase, "let me get my bearings"? It translates into meaning, let me have a chance to synchronize my sense of awareness to my surroundings. Getting your bearings in a new situation is a good example of how our brain, as an organ, doesn't think by itself. Rather, it's a sensory processing machine used in sync with the context or environment. So while the processing itself might be inside the head, so to speak, the thinking exists in the pathway of data that flows reciprocally from the source to the individual. So learning, meaning literally the formation of new neural connections, develops through interactions with the environment. Experience mediates learning. New memories are formed through experience and later drawn upon to help the person navigate the social world. Socio-cultural paradigms accept that human thinking and learning can only be explained by taking into account how the person interacts with the environment and with others in the environment. Thinking and consciousness cannot be isolated from the social world. Another key insight has to do with the special way that people think. Humans are able to conjure up cognitive representations of the physical world inside their heads. In other words, humans can represent things mentally. They can reason logically and inferentially about cognitive representations, and they're able to mentally represent what they believe to be the perceptions of those around them. These abilities to make cognitive representations, to make recursive inferences about them, and to scrutinize thoughts against broader social norms is what makes human thinking unique. This is also what enabled human beings to amass and transmit knowledge from one generation to the next. One type of thinking that's unique to humans is co-consciousness, the awareness of a phenomenon while at the same time being cognizant of another person's awareness of the same thing. Humans are social creatures, and from our first weeks of life, our interactions with others shape the way we consciously experience the world. Most of our thoughts and memories are shaped by other participants within our social worlds. Rich explanations of this highly social human way of thinking and awareness have become recently available in science and can now be applied to education contexts and pedagogical practices. This view that I just described, often called the social interactionist paradigm, is the view for learning cultures. This way of thinking about thinking determines how all activities in the classroom are organized. Students have opportunities to exercise their ability to make mental representations about things that are important in the curriculum, about everything from equations to story plots, or from structure of cells to causes of the American Revolution. But most critically, they should have opportunities to interact with their peers about these topics in order to hear and understand what others think. These kinds of social interactions are what help students broaden their perspectives and develop higher order thinking abilities. So as you can see, the social dimensions of situations play a huge part in how people think and learn. The next key insight has to do with the special way that people get along. When thinking and learning are viewed from a rational empirical perspective, as isolated individual processes that happen inside the heads of individuals, instructional interventions focus on isolated skills through a process of transmission from teacher to individual. But since the socio-cultural paradigm accepts that the social world is as consequential to learning as what exists inside the learner's head, After all, the machine of cognition is built in social space, not inside the person. Social norms must play a role in explaining development and learning. In other words, purely cognitive explanations tell only part of the phenomenon of learning. The relationship between the person and the environment is crucial to truly understanding development, much less to develop effective methods of instruction. This idea seems like common sense. We tend to be less successful when we lack confidence or have self-doubt. We tend to succeed more if we're confident and secure. Our performance is buoyed when we're supported by those around us and weakened when others work to undermine our efforts. Yet conventional educational methods have failed to take into account these relational realities that exist between learners and the social context in which learning occurs. All this is changing. We now understand that the beliefs people hold about the way they think, how they learn, how smart they are, and what they're capable of achieving all play a huge role in determining how effectively they will learn. Also, since higher order thinking depends largely on how able a person is to exchange perspectives with others, the nature of their relationships to others is a key factor in learning. So, within the learning cultures model, the social world is a central factor in the equation of learning. Specifically, positive social norms are intentionally developed through clear and transparent rules and procedures so that students themselves can take responsibility in helping to create the social worlds that will best support their learning. And helping students better understand their relationship to the social world is a priority. So let's summarize and review. In this lecture, you learned about some of the reasons why substantial changes in the structure of school systems are warranted by new insights from science. You learned about new definitions of literacy, new insights about learning, human thinking, and the role of relationships in learning.